You were involved in the investigation of our friend Jim Leeward's accident at Reno, which made news pretty much around the world. And maybe you could talk about what you learned in that investigation.
That was such a giant tragedy. In 2011, I was racing an airplane after the Sea Fury called Riff Raff. I was racing an airplane that had been owned by and raced by a guy named Mike Brown, and he built it up to the point where he actually won the Unlimited Championship one year in it. But it was also a year in which the Mustangs blew up. Voodoo and Strega did not do well those years, and so a Sea Fury, Hawker Sea Fury, was able to win the Unlimited Championship. And I was racing another Sea Fury called race number 232, and of course that wound up being the fastest Sea Fury ever to race Reno. It had a boil-off system for the oil cooler. So rather than having a big opening in the wing leading edge where you took in air, let it blow through the oil cooler, and then dump it out under the wing, which creates a lot of drag, that Sea Fury had a boil-off system behind the cockpit that had a water methanol bath with the oil cooler immersed in it, and 50-50 mix of water and methanol that will boil at 80 degrees centigrade. Well, that's right where we want the engine oil, 80 degrees centigrade. So it was an ideal thing. No aerodynamic drag from it. There was one little exhaust that would exhaust the steam that you formed from boiling that. So that was a very fast airplane. I had qualified in that airplane and set the qualifying record for a Sea Fury. And I had qualified fourth place out of all the Unlimiteds that year, 2011. Jimmy had qualified fifth place with the Galloping Ghost, and he had actually raced the Galloping Ghost the year before, 2010, and possibly could have won the gold that year because he had a really fast airplane, but he didn't get to race the final race. Jimmy had showed up late, if I remember right, shown up late, and so he had to start at the bottom of the bronze and then work his way through the bronze and then through the silver and then through the gold. So he was in the gold heat for the final in 2010. But meanwhile, we had made a crosswind rule, and the crosswind, hoping it would never happen, but the crosswinds were over the limits that we had said we would fly in. So he didn't get to race in the final race. They just awarded the places based on what your qualification had been up to that point. So this accident might have happened that year, 2010. But in 2011, I was there with race number 232, the Sea Fury I was referring to, and I qualified ahead of Jimmy. And Jimmy was there, and that airplane was really moving. He had flown that thing at well over 500 miles an hour. And he got asked, well, what's your strategy for winning? And he had told, I guess it was a reporter, he had said, we're going to win the Unlimited Championship while using less horsepower than anybody else. And that was because that airplane had been so cleaned up in terms of removing the big air scoop under the wing that we refer to as the doghouse, removing that entire thing from it and having a boil-off system for the radiator and also for the oil cooler. And so it was a clean airplane. He also had all the high-speed modifications to the engine. And the engines are so very important in air racing. The aerodynamics is a really important thing, but the horsepower of the engine seems to be the predominant factor in all of these things. So he was going to win the Unlimited Championship in 2011, I'm convinced, because he was fast enough. And I didn't get to be in that fateful race because in my qualifying run, I had burned a hole through the number one piston in the engine, and so I was out of the race for that year. And there was a funny story because the morning of the accident, Jimmy had talked to me. He and I had been chatting about things, and he said, you know, I'm really sad that you're not going to be in that race today, because you know what I was going to do? He said, I was going to stay behind you for about 1 or 2 laps, and then I was going to smoke your ass, is what he told me. So
And you guys were good
we
friends.
were good friends. I had known Jimmy for 28 years. In fact, 2 years prior to this, my wife and I flew my Bonanza down to Ocala, Florida, to help celebrate his 50th wedding anniversary to Betty. Big celebration down there. And so here we are. Jimmy was going to win the Unlimited Championship that year in 2011. It looked like a sure thing. So since I was out of the race, I was standing on the wing of one of the Tiger Cats, the F7 Tiger Cats, in the pit area. I watched the whole thing happen. I watched Jimmy coming into the home stretch past the grandstands and past where all the crowd was, and I watched that airplane go into a pitch-up maneuver and a roll maneuver to the right, and it rolled over the top and headed toward the grandstands, and I watched it hit the ground and said, oh my gosh, Jimmy, straight down. It looked like straight down from where I was looking at it. Now, I didn't even know that it had gone into the crowd, that it had gone into the pit seats, the special seats out there on the ramp area. So, as far as I knew, although immediately you started hearing calls for ambulances and lots of doctors and nurses and all of that sort of thing, so figured out it had been the catastrophe that it was. Now, it was about impossible to tell just from listening to it or looking at it to see exactly what it was. And one of the lawyers that I have worked with, well, the one I worked with the longest, the first person who first got me into this business of being an expert witness, called me that day and said, Hoot, you have got to get through to the leadership of the air racing organization, because they need to be talking to me right away. Because the accident investigation starts immediately, and there are certain actions that you've got to do and you've got to accomplish, and they can make this a simple, well, it's hard to say a simple investigation. It can make it easier, or it can make life a whole lot more difficult. And so I did put the ops boss in touch with the lawyer that I talked with, and then it was a horribly sad several days. The races, for good reason, were canceled for the year. We didn't complete the races. It turns out we had 10 dead on the ground, and a lot of people with horrible injuries as well. And so if this had happened on the backside of the race course out in the desert out there, the races would have continued, because we were accustomed to losing a pilot now and then. But because of the nature of the tragedy, that was the end of the races that year. I got a phone call from that same lawyer a couple days later saying, okay, you need to be the party representative for the air racing organization for Reno Air Races. And of course, that was a logical fit, because I had done so much accident investigation and also working as an expert witness, that I was the logical person to be the party representative for Reno, for the racing organization. And so one of the things that we did was this took, I'm trying to remember how much later it was a couple months later, we went to a place north of Sacramento where the wreckage was being stored, and that was depressing as well, to be looking at the wreckage, because the biggest piece of that airplane might have been perhaps 4 feet long. Biggest chunk that was left was 4 feet long. And all of the parts of the airplane, all the minuscule little things that get scooped up, get put into these gigantic bean bags. And what you're doing in a wreckage inspection is you're going through these bags bit by bit, and they'll lift them up with a forklift, because you can't lift one of these bags. They'll lift them up with a forklift, and dumped the bag out on the floor in the hangar. And you'd go through it bit by bit, looking for anything that might be evidence. We had a couple of specific things we were looking for, and we found most of them, but there was a device called a bob weight for the control stick that we were looking for that we never did find. And it's about a 5-pound block of steel on the end of a lever arm. We looked for that, and when we'd finished looking through one bag, we'd put everything back in that bag, go to the next bag. If I remember, we had about 4 of these giant bags that, when they were full of airplane debris, these bags would stand about 5.5 feet tall and about 5 feet in diameter. Well, we went all the way through all 4 or 5 bags, however many it was, and we didn't find the bob weight. So we turned around and went through them all over again.
Had you ever flown that airplane?
No, I had not flown Jimmy's
But
airplane.
you knew the airplane. It's kind of like picking through an old friend. Yeah.
I had known the Mustang because I'd flown a Mustang 2 times prior to that, and I had been at Minden, Nevada, hanging out with Jimmy when he was doing some of his flight testing of that airplane right before the races started in 2010. So got to talk to him, and he had asked me to make him a calculation of what his stall speed would probably be, that sort of thing. And so I was a little bit familiar with that airplane, but I had been all over it that summer of 2010, took photos of the cockpit and all that sort of thing. So had his whole instrument panel and all that in my data. But it turns out that the biggest clue came from the photographs and the videos that everyone took as the airplane was coming past the grandstands. And in that, what we saw the trim tab for the left elevator. 3/4 of it broke loose and fell to the ground. And so that was certainly going to be a part of the picture.
For anyone that does not know what a trim tab does to an airplane, you could help us with that a little bit.
Sure. And I was going to go there, but what the elevator trim tab does is that an airplane, based on its weight and center of gravity and the speed it's flying at, will either be what's called in trim, which means it'll fly straight and level. You can take your hands off the control stick and it'll continue to fly straight and level. Let's say it has a nose down tendency and the airplane wants to go down. What we have on the elevator of the P-51 Mustang is a trim tab on the left elevator and a trim tab on the right elevator, and they work together. So if the airplane is tending to go down, then what happens is the trim tab on the very back of the elevator would go down. That drives the elevator up, which holds the nose up. And so that was certainly going to be something we looked at very heavily, which we did. And it turns out, from looking at the video footage and the still photos of the Galloping Ghost going around the race course at 500 miles an hour, it turns out that the trim tab on the left side, which was the only one that was active — I wish Jimmy had left the right elevator trim tab be active, but he decided he wanted this to be just like an airplane called Stiletto, which had been very similar to the Galloping Ghost in its configuration. And Stiletto only had the left side trim active. And so Jimmy had implemented an electrical trim to it, to where he could just run the motor and trim that trim tab. What we saw in the photos and in the video was that trim tab was deflected up considerably. That means that it's pushing down elevator. It's pushing the elevators down, because at 500 plus miles an hour, without that trim tab, the airplane would want to pitch up rather violently. And so the trim tab is holding the airplane from pitching up. Well, what happens when the trim tab comes off? 80-90% of the trim tab came off. The airplane pitched up, Jimmy had a telemetry system in the airplane that was recording G's, and it pegged at 10 G's. And then it was above the scale for a period of time, and then it came back down below 10 G's after the airplane had gone out of control. So what we calculated, if I remember right, was that the airplane saw 17 G's. Well, 17 G's is enough to put any pilot to sleep. And when I say put them to sleep, what happens is when you're pulling G's, the blood in your brain tends to be pushed down into your lower body, and you can gray out, which is where you lose enough blood flow in your brain that your optic nerve isn't able to see, and so your vision will turn all gray. That's known as graying out. Shortly after you gray out, you black out. You physically pass out because your brain does not have enough blood. Well, this 17.4 Gs came on in about 4/10 of a second, so it was a rapid pitch up. Jimmy was unconscious immediately, so now he can't fly the airplane. He's not flying the airplane. In fact, the photos that show the airplane heading for the ground, you can't see him in the photo. He is slumped down in the seat. So the airplane, unfortunately, had a right roll tendency, and it pitched up. Jimmy's unconscious at this point, and now the airplane starts rolling over the top in a barrel roll to the right and winds up pointing straight down and went right into the crowd. And so what we found with the trim tab was that the elastic stop nuts, which are there to give enough friction so that the bolts can't work their way loose, the elastic stop nuts were too old and too worn, and the bolts were able to back out and give some slop to the hinge points of that trim tab. And at the speed he was going, that airplane went fast enough that that trim tab fluttered, which means it's bouncing back and forth. It couldn't stand the stresses, and the trim tab broke off, and at that point, that 17G pitch up happened.
I guess I want to ask, is there any kind of inspection of the aircraft program in NASA? They come and look at your car before they let you race. Can they do that at the Reno Air Races?
Yes, in fact, the airplane had passed the tech inspection, and they all have to pass that. The tech inspectors are very experienced and very accomplished mechanics, and very experienced in doing that particular job, doing the technical inspections to verify that we have a safe airplane. They missed this one. But I can tell you that certainly this became an area that got thoroughly checked after that. Of course, by now, we're too late. The horse is already out of the barn. But there is
We can learn from it.
We can learn from it, and sadly, we did learn from it. But that's another area that really gets thoroughly checked nowadays at the Reno Air Races. So we learn from mistakes, we learn from accidents, we learn from tragedies, and this is one of those.
Ladies and gentlemen, your new Unlimited World Unlimited Air Race Champion, Robert Hoot Gibson.
We've talked about the dangers of the environment in space and what can go wrong. Earlier, we talked about the fact that you felt air racing was more dangerous than space. And I guess the only way I can ask it is, how do you process danger? How do you say what I'm going to do in the face of danger is worth it? If that makes any sense.
Well, to answer that, I guess I'll say that, I get questioned all the time, do you consider yourself to be a risk taker? And I say, no, I don't consider myself to be a risk taker. All of the risky things that I've done, though, are all in the world of aviation, in the world of flying. Now, I have a lot of experience. I have more than 14,500 hours of flight time. And so with all of that, I believe that I am very much able to analyze what I'm about to do. Certainly, the aeronautical engineering is a big advantage for being able to analyze. Also, the experience of test pilot school, being able to do a risk analysis that goes along with that. And so the things that I've done that are really exciting, like flying in the air races, I think are a bit of a calculated judgment that says, okay, I'm going to have to be very much alert and very much cautious because air racing is probably more dangerous than the space shuttle was, because we flew the space shuttle 135 times and we lost 2 of those. But when you look at air racing, I raced at the Reno air races over the course of 18 years altogether. And in 8 of those years, we had at least a pilot fatality. So 44% of the years that I raced at Reno, we had a pilot die. And one of those years, 2007, we had 3 pilots die. So based on a statistic like that, that's probably, well, it is. It's more dangerous than flying combat missions over Hanoi in the Vietnam War, and it's more dangerous than going to space. But there is a huge reward for taking that risk. Seeing what the Earth looks like from space is certainly worth that risk. And our experience and the Russian experience has been that the majority of your missions fly just fine and come back safely. And there doesn't have to be a fatal mission, even 1 out of 10. So certainly everything we do in life is a calculated risk, and doing that was a calculated risk. And as far as air racing goes, I am not brave enough to race in one of the classes out there at Reno where the airplanes are all nearly identical, that being the T6 class. You could offer me a whole lot of money and I wouldn't take it to race in the T6 class because those airplanes are too closely bunched up and too even, whereas the classes that I've raced in, the unlimited class, the jet class, and the Formula One class, airplanes are going to space out reasonably. So sure, right at the start, you're right next to 9 other airplanes, but very rapidly, you are pretty much flying on your own, especially if you're out in front. I got to have that experience the one time, and that's really great. That's really great to be way out in front by yourself. And sure, there's a risk of your hitting the ground, but if you hit the ground, it's probably because you did it. And so it's the sort of thing that, are you confident that you can fly that thing and not hit a pylon, not hit the ground? And do you think you're capable of doing that? And if the answer is no, then you better not do it. But I certainly always felt that, yes, I'm capable of keeping the airplane above the ground and keeping it in the air. And so it's one of those calculated risks.
I was going to say in air racing, you have this proximity to other pilots whose behavior and decisions you can't control. But then, as I thought about it, when you're on the shuttle, you're dependent upon your crew as well and other people performing their jobs. So I guess that's just a faith in human beings that you have to have.
Yes, yes. And in addition to that, we are very strict in the Reno air races. And when I first started racing, the first year that I actually got to race was 1998. It was not required to have gone through training, formal training there at Reno in something they call Pylon Racing Seminar, PRS. Now another acronym, yes. Now it is required. You don't get to race unless you have been through PRS, Pylon Racing Seminar, and then you have to race, you have to have raced at least once in the previous 2 years. So let's say you went through Pylon Racing Seminar, and now you raced in 2007. Let's say you didn't race in 2008. You could still race in 2009 because you were within 2 years of when you went through PRS. But if you didn't race in 2009, you had to repeat Pylon Racing Seminar before you could race again. So they have been very strict about qualifications and about experience. And in addition to that, we also had a professional standards committee. And the professional standards committee was made up of all very experienced race pilots. And they watched every race, and they watched every racer. And if there was someone that wasn't flying the way that he or she was supposed to be flying, the professional standards committee had the power to ground him. And we did. I was part of it one year that we grounded a pilot and told him, here's what we want you to do better at. So you're through for this year. Why don't you go get this kind of experience and a little more time doing this, and then come back to us. So it is dangerous enough without a pilot that you can't rely on. And what we really need, and we need this in almost any aviation endeavor, is somebody that's predictable. You need to be predictable, and you need to be predictable in a good way, that you're going to do the right things. And we have, over the years in the Reno air races, grounded pilots that were not predictable enough, because they're going to wind up killing themselves and probably killing somebody else as well. So these are some of the hazard alleviation procedures that you go through to try to make it as safe as you can possibly make it.
You said earlier that it's fun. What, and I guess when I think about you building your own Formula One airplane and seeing what you can do with it, that's a work of your hands, your mind, your skill. And I can see where that would be something a guy might want to do. In the unlimited class, you're dealing with modified World War II pursuit planes mostly. And what is the joy? I mean, it's always fun to win anything, but what's the joy that you find in air racing?
Well, there's a lot of piloting that goes into it, a tremendous amount of piloting that goes into it, because you're going to wind up passing other airplanes. Because if you're one of the faster ones in a heat, you're going to catch up with the tail end Charlies and have to pass them. And you're going to get in a duel with another airplane that's fairly closely matched, and whichever one of you can be the most efficient and get the most out of the amount of horsepower you have and get the most out of the aerodynamics that you have, then you're going to be the one that succeeds. But there's also a whole lot of satisfaction that comes out of, for example, the airplane that I initially raced in the unlimited class, race number 99 Riff Raff. The first year that we raced it, which was 1998, we came in the middle of the silver category. The 8 fastest airplanes are the gold category, the next 8 are the silver, and then the slower 8 are the bronze category. And we started out and placed in the middle of the silver in the finals. And that was an accomplishment because we moved up, if I remember right, we moved up from the top of the bronze category into the silver. And we were tweaking the engine, we were tweaking the water injection system for the engine and all of that. And on top of that, your pilot has to fly the thing accurately. Don't use too much rudder, too much side slip. Don't pull on too many G's if you can help it. So there's a lot of piloting that goes into it. And so when you succeed at it, there's a whole lot of a reward that comes to you from having done it well. So using that airplane as an example, We started out in the silver category, and we raced 98, 99, 2000. We didn't come back in 2001, but each year modifications were made to the airplane to clean it up aerodynamically and make it possibly go a little bit faster. 2002, the fourth year that we brought that airplane, we made it into the gold. We made it into the gold category. And then wound up, over the years, moving up in the gold category to where I placed fourth in the gold 3 years in a row. 2005, 6, and 7. Placed fourth place in the gold. Starting out as a 388 mile an hour airplane, average speed, and finishing up as a 437 mile an hour airplane. So there's a ton of satisfaction from doing that. And hey, let's just talk about the racing itself. It's fun to fly low, but it's dangerous. And so the only time I fly low is at the Reno air races. Watching the ground go by you at 400 and 500 miles an hour is pretty darn thrilling, because it's really scooting on by. And that's fun. That's really fun.
Which you've probably answered this question 1,000 times. Do you have a sensation of speed in space when you're in orbit?
You actually do. Even though you don't have a sensation of 17,500 miles an hour, though. But you're moving at 5 miles per second in orbit. So that's really scooting. And if you look at the ground, you can see that the ground is definitely moving by under you. But not like being in a racer at 50 feet above the ground doing 400. The ground is really speeding by. I did get asked to come brief the CABE, the Columbia Accident Investigation Board. There's that NASA acronym again, CAIB.
Could we have gotten to space without acronyms? And how do you remember them all?
Well, yeah, mostly I remember them, but no, I don't think we could have done that, because all of our checklists would have weighed too much. But, we can say RMS activation, instead of remote manipulator system activation and all that. But I did get asked to come brief them, and it was a little bit odd, John, because I got called by one of the assistants to the board that said, "Hey, Admiral Gaiman has asked if you would come brief them." And I said, "Well, sure, I'd be happy to. What would he like me to brief them on?" And the answer was, "Well, whatever you'd like." And so I'm thinking, well, this is a little bit unusual. So I did go brief the Columbia board, and I don't know that they had heard the story of my incident that occurred on STS-27, because it certainly seemed like they had never heard of it. And this was almost identical to what happened to Columbia. Only in our case, it was damaged tiles. It wasn't a hole in the leading edge of the wing that brought down Columbia. But it was so very similar in many ways. During launch, you get hit by something and it causes you a problem. And so I went to brief them, and this was somewhat earlier in the Columbia investigation. I don't think it had been concluded yet that what happened was foam came loose, put a hole in the leading edge of the left wing. And so I had done a point paper way back, oh golly, this would have been 1989. Columbia had a really hot reentry on STS-29, which was a classified Department of Defense mission. I don't think there was a whole lot of widespread news about it, because again, it was a classified mission, just like my STS-27 was a classified mission. But they had a really hot reentry on, I think it was the right wing. I guess it doesn't matter which wing. It was one of the wings, had a lot of slumped tiles, which means tiles that were in the process of melting. So something had happened on the right wing of Columbia during reentry that maybe it was the left wing. In fact, I think it was the left wing, because at the time we were questioning all these anomalies that we saw in the Columbia accident in the left wing. And it turns out that I had done an assessment when I worked as the chief of the safety branch for the astronaut corps to look at the smoothness or lack of smoothness of the tiles on the left wing. And there's a very tight specification called step and gap, how big the gap can be between the tiles and how big a step you can have from one tile to the next. And it's like 1/10 of an inch or less that you can have. Say you have a tile here that's this level, you can't have more than 1/10 of an inch on the next tile behind it sticking up, or you will cause heating right there. And so I had done an assessment of what was the step and gap, and it was a number that got generated called K equivalent, KEQ. I don't remember how it was calculated, but it took into account the gap and also the rise in the next tile and all those things. Turned out Columbia had the bumpiest wings of any orbiter. And so this was before we figured out that a foam block had hit the leading edge of the wing. So I had done an assessment of that. And what they told me was that after that STS-29 reentry, they had, or no, I'm sorry, it was STS-28. If I said 29 earlier, it was actually 28.
Yeah.
Okay, it was 28. That afterwards, they had smoothed out a lot of those tiles. And so the topic was, okay, could uneven wings have caused the Columbia accident? And so I briefed them on that, although by the time I briefed them, we had figured out that it was a foam impact on the leading edge of the wing. But I also briefed them on the whole story of STS-27 and the fact that we had 770 damaged tiles. And I told my whole story. They asked a number of questions. And then at the end of everything, just like the Joint Chiefs in a way, Admiral Gaiman said, "All right, well, do we have any more questions for Hoot?" And there weren't any more questions for me. And Admiral Gaiman said, "Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've been listening to the luckiest man alive," meaning that we had survived the STS-27 reentry with all that tile damage. And so after the Columbia accident, I'm told that there was a reinvigoration of looking at, is there a way that we can make tile repairs on orbit? And I think they had developed a little bit of a capability to fill gaps and to fill up a hole where a tile might be missing. And at least did that to cover us for the remainder of the Space Shuttle program. On December the 2nd, we sat on the launch pad for about 4.5 hours and used up the whole entire launch window hoping for the winds to die down. And right about the end, when it looked like we're not going to get to launch today either, the winds died down enough to where they concluded that we are at 100% design load. Okay, we can launch. So we launched, and we had very little time left. I want to say seconds, maybe 30 seconds left in the launch window. So we just barely made it into space that day. Unbeknownst to us, during the launch, the nose cap of the right-hand booster rocket, that's the big white rocket that's on the side of the thing, the nose cap has a coating of ablative material on it, and the ablative material obviously wasn't strong enough. It broke loose, and pieces of it showered my right wing on Atlantis. So, of course, we couldn't see any of that. But the ground always goes through all the launch footage, all the movies, all the stills, everything, to look for this sort of thing. So the next day, after we had gone to orbit, and on the first day, we deployed a major new intelligence satellite for the United States. And that's about as much as I'm allowed to say about it, even to this day. This was 1988. So what's that, 34 years ago? And I'm still not allowed to say what it was we carried, but I am allowed to say it was a major new intelligence satellite. Mission Control called us and said, hey, Hoot, during launch we saw something hit your right wing. We want you to take the robot arm, which is, they call it the RMS, the Remote Manipulator System. It has a television camera on the end of it as part of the system. Said, we want you to hang it over the right side of the orbiter and look at your right wing and tell us what you see. Well, I will never forget, we maneuvered the arm, and Mike Mullane was my arm operator, so he moved the arm over there, and we brought up the television image of the right wing, and I looked at what I was seeing, and I said to myself, we are going to die, because we could see a vast amount of tile damage on the right wing. So I keyed the mic, and I told the Capcom, if I remember right, the capsule communicator, or Capcom, was Dave Hilmers. And I called him and I said, Dave, we're seeing a lot of tile damage on the right wing. And he said, okay, we'll get back to you. So they went away for a while, and it turned out Department of Defense didn't want any video coming down, just in case we would have the death ray in the picture. Okay, we didn't have a death ray. Just in case there would be something classified.
The flux capacitor.
Yeah, the flux capacitor, like, from Back to the Future. Yeah. Yes. So DOD didn't want anything, video, any kind of imagery at all coming down from the mission. And in fact, every photograph that we shot over the whole course of it was only 4.5 days. But one of the goals that you had as a shuttle crew was to shoot up every frame of film that you had on board. You didn't want to come back and land with any unexposed film. But DOD had to go through every single frame with a microscope and make sure there was nothing classified that accidentally showed up in any of these things. So, for example, a shot looking out the window of the Earth and a particular point on the Earth, if somehow the time of that frame showed up in the frame, that was going to be a classified item, because where we were at any particular time was going to be secret, although you could pretty well tell where we were. But anyway, so DOD finally relented and said, okay, since you really need to take a look at your right wing, we'll let you send down encrypted video. Okay, well, encrypted video isn't very good. It doesn't have very good resolution. And I guess what it does, it shoots a frame, and it takes about 3 seconds to encrypt it and record it, and then another frame, another 3 seconds. So the resolution was so poor that down on the ground, unbeknownst to us, Mission Control looked at it and said, that's not tile damage, that's just lighting and shadows that these boys are looking at. Hoot's all screwed up. Well, did they ever tell us that? No. They came back, I guess after 24 hours, because I think they looked at it for a full day before they came back. And Dave Hilmers called and said, okay, hey, Hoot, we've got the resolution on your tiles. And I said, okay, yeah, great, go ahead, Dave, what? He said, it's no problem, just re-enter just like we always do. Well, I was incredulous. I couldn't believe it. And I keyed the mic and I said, Dave, what are they basing that on? And he said, okay, well, stand by, because he had to get the rationale from the engineers and all. And he came back about 10 minutes later and he said, Hoot, they looked at it and they said it's no worse than what we've seen on other missions. Notice they did not say, we don't think you're seeing tile damage. We think you're just seeing lighting and shadowing. They didn't say that. So this is called a failure to communicate. Now, I think I was communicating because I said, Dave, we're seeing a lot of tile damage on that right wing. So they came back and said, it's no worse than what we've seen before. Well, I said, well, you know what? I've been here since before STS-1, the first shuttle launch, and I've never seen anything like this. And then I did something that I shouldn't have done. I kind of gave in. I said, okay, but you guys are the experts. I should have dug my heels in and said, hey, let's talk about this, because I'm definitely seeing serious tile damage. But I think the big failure to communicate was on Mission Control. They never said to me, you are not seeing tile damage. Hoot, you're just messed up. It's just lights and shadows. Because if they had done that, I would have said, okay, I'm sending you clear TV because I'm definitely seeing tile damage. But I caved in because it was always, and still is, considered bad form for an astronaut to get into an argument with mission control. In fact, it's career limiting for you to get into a contest, a fighting contest with mission control. So I gave in, and I shouldn't have. I should have made them talk about it some more. And so there were some funny things that came out of it. The night before re-entry, I remember one of the astronauts was talking about how he was a little bit more than nervous about this re-entry tomorrow. And I said to him, oh, come on, don't feel that way. No use dying all tensed up. And so, this is fighter pilot humor, or gallows humor.
Gallows humor.
And however, all the way down on re-entry, I was watching the elevons. I can see right where the left elevons are and where the right elevons are on my display. And I knew that if we started to burn through the right wing, what I would see is we would build up more drag on that right wing. And to balance the amount of drag, the left elevon would be going down. And that creates drag. That's how we create drag with an elevon at this 40-degree angle of attack that we fly re-entry at. And so all the way down, I have the audio that I made from the re-entry, that we made, the crew made for the re-entry. And all the way down in the atmosphere, about every 2 minutes, I'd say, guys, the controls look good. The elevons look good. So we watched them all the way down, because I knew what I'd see a split. The right elevons would be going up, the left elevons would be going down. Oh, an elevon is a combination aileron and elevator, so that's why it's called elevon. So that's what we have on the trailing edge of both wings. I'd see the right elevon going up and the left elevon going down. And if that happened, I knew that I might have 60 seconds to tell Mission Control what I thought of their analysis. But fortunately, all the way down, the elevons stayed matched. So that said to me, I'm pretty sure we're not burning through over on the right wing. But after we landed, there was amazement. There was absolute amazement. We had damaged 770 tiles. And I think 300 of them were serious damage to the tiles, chunks bigger than an inch that were chopped out of the tiles.
And just for perspective, what percentage of the tiles is 770?
It's not a real big percentage, but it was over on the right wing.
It's enough to destroy the shuttle.
Over on the right wing, oh, absolutely. And even more than that, John, we had one tile that was entirely missing, which we had not been able to see with the robot camera, with the RMS camera. We had not been able to see that we had one tile entirely gone, and we almost burned through at that location. We lucked out many ways that we came back at all, but we lucked out in that particular location where that tile had been mounted. There was a thick plate under it that had something to do with a ground plane antenna for the L-band system. So there was a thicker plate there, and it didn't burn through. If it had just been the regular aluminum surface, I suppose there's a chance that might have burned through. And if that had happened, we might have been the Columbia accident on only the second launch after the Challenger accident. And if we had broken up at Mach 17, which is where Columbia broke up in 2003, if we had broken up at Mach 17, where were we? We were in the North Pacific, just south of the Aleutian Islands. We would have gone into the ocean when we broke up. There wouldn't have been much to find. That would have been the very end of us, of course, but it would have been the end of the shuttle program, because the discussion would have sounded like this. We gave you guys all this money to fix your space shuttles, and you lost the second launch after you started up again. It's the end. We can't afford to keep doing this. It would have been the end of the shuttle program. It would have been the end of us, of course. But where was the big mistake? The big mistake was Mission Control didn't tell us what they were thinking. We definitely told them what we were thinking. And that's an important lesson for leadership and for communication. Tell what you're thinking. And I gave in, and I shouldn't have done that. I should have said, hey, you need to talk to me a little bit more about this, because I'm pretty darn sure that I've never seen anything like this before. So I guess I'm partly to blame for us entering that way without knowing that Mission Control could have possibly looked at something. Maybe there was something we could do to fly a more gentle reentry. I don't know.
When you got down and saw that tile damage, did you have to keep your hands in your pockets to keep from punching somebody in the face?
Well, no, because, we wouldn't have known who to punch. There probably would have been too many people for us to punch. But in the debrief, this won't give us any great satisfaction whatsoever. I asked the lead ascent and entry flight director, who was responsible for mission control as the leadership in mission control. I asked him in the debrief, I said, okay, if you had listened to us and paid attention to what we were saying and realized that we did have serious tile damage, what do you suppose we could have done? And he said, I don't know. And that was as far as it went. So what did we do after STS-27? The only thing we fixed after STS-27 was we went to a stronger ablative. Remember several minutes ago I mentioned the ablative on the nose cone of the right booster rocket disintegrated. They went to a stronger ablative, so we had no more problems with that ever again.
I don't know what an ablative is.
Oh, that's a material that will erode under real high temperature and burn off very gradually. All the original Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo spacecraft had an ablative heat shield. So it would burn and char, and then the char would break away, and then the next layer would burn and char and break away. And that was how you protected the aluminum surface of the vehicle. So that was to protect the booster rocket nose caps, because those could be reused. So, or just to protect, I'm not sure those can be reused, but it was to protect the rate gyros and things that would be up in the nose cone of the booster rocket. We went to a stronger ablative.
If you enjoyed this video, please remember to like and subscribe. And as always, thank you for watching.